This presentation is a part of a bigger project devoted to the Old Believers' identity and relevant past. When I say relevant past, I mean events and their interpretations reflected in the living memories of the Old Believers. The project's aims and tasks are connected with the question on how Old Believers of the Northwestern Black Sea region remember their history today, how their past is interpreted in the present day, how they construct different versions of the past in different communities. Just a few words on the field. Fleeing from the persecution by the Tsarist government and the official Orthodox Church, those who refused to follow church reforms in the mid-17th century, later called Old Believers, migrated to the confines of the Russian Empire. Establishing closed communities where they could reproduce pre-schism orthodoxy, they built their claim of true orthodoxy on the refusal to change. So all believers maintain their faith together with essential traditional practices. I have conducted research in 17 settlements of the region since 2008. The study of the Old Believers of this particular region is especially interesting as it includes both states that were a part of the Russian Empire for a long time and then were a part of the USSR, the Republic of Moldova with Transnistria, and states that developed outside of Russia, Romania. Thereafter, the Old Believers formed varied images of the past after the resettlement to these territories. So I was interested in how they remember about their history, what events of the past are relevant to them today. So I could reveal some turning points of history in different Old Believer communities of the region. I was interested in how they speak about their history today, what they demonstrate, what they tell about when they speak about their past. One of such turning points in the history of the Old Believers of Moldova is an exile to Kurgan Oblast in 1949. In 1948, there were prepared lists of the wealthiest peasants, kulaks, for dispossession. In July 1949, they were deported. And today, for this presentation, I will use materials on one of the oldest and biggest villages with Old Believer population in present-day Republic of Moldova in Kunicha. 25 families, 120 people from Kunicha were sent to Kurgan Oblast. The list of the people deported you can find in the work of the local historian Natalia Bakumova-Zabunova. Her monograph is devoted to Old Orthodox Kunicha. There you can see some photos and some interesting facts about the exile, among others. Studying memories of the exile, I based my study on oral narratives recorded in 2017-2019 in Kunicha village. I spoke with those who were sent to Kurgan Oblast and returned to Moldova, as well as with representatives of the second and third generation. As we know, memories about historical events are mostly communicated through biographical texts. A lot of theoretical elaborations at the intersection of migration and material culture studies show that material objects play the roles of reference points in the memories about migration, including forced one. Traumatic experience being reflected through material losses. Of course, when people speak about the exile, they speak about the material environment, what they had and what they had not. They remember about the lost home, about the things they couldn't have in exile, about everything that was around them, about their material environment. But what interests me even more is another part of the narratives that deals with the preservation of their faith under the circumstances of the exile. My interlocutors shared their memories on how they had to violate religious prescriptions because they had no possibility to follow them under those circumstances. They told me about maintaining personal religiosity and transmitting it to younger generation in Kurgan. First of all, I have to say that speaking about the Soviet past in general, the old believers of the region mostly recall the practices of symbolic resistance to the actions of the authorities aimed at fighting against religion. Despite the statements of the official authorities throughout the Soviet period, the old believers continued to wear crosses. They did not allow their children to wear pioneer ties. They took children to church, secretly baptized them. Some of them even observed fasts. At the same time, in the contemporary assessment of the late Soviet period, a parallel is observed between the acquisition of freedoms in the religious sphere, the lifting of a number of prohibitions, and the weakening of true faith. Of course, many memories look similar. People in Kunicha and people who were in Kurgan Oblast at that time remember the prohibitions to wear crosses. And when I speak about exile with those people, they say that the same situation was in Kurgan and here in Kunicha. However, speaking of the exile, most of my interlocutors emphasized all believers had to live together with the representatives of different faiths. There were other Orthodox Christians, new ritualists, among Moldovans, among Ukrainians. There were Jews. So under the circumstances, they could not always follow their religious prescriptions in everyday life. These prescriptions touch upon the religious purity. So the old believers emphasize that they could not maintain religious boundaries when being in exile. Here on the slide, you can see a fragment of the interview with a lady who was deported and her relative, a younger man who knows about the deportation from older people's narratives. The lady emphasizes that there were adherents of different faiths with them, that as old believers, they couldn't, she says here, you can see, as old believers we can't, but we lived in one room with the Ukrainian family, and they were all believers. So she doesn't pronounce it explicitly, but she always pays attention that they were among people of different faiths. So it was in usual environment, all believers would not do that. But they had no choice there. She continues, they built their own house, but for a time being, they had to live with a Tatar woman in her apartment. But after a pause, she says that when they were in Siberia, her mother transmitted religious knowledge to her and her younger brother. She says, her mother taught us, pray first, our Father, and my children, I taught them. After that, I asked, how did you maintain your faith there? And the man who also took part in the interview showed interest and asked, yes, how was it? Was there a church? How did you keep your faith? And the woman replied, there was no church. So we prayed at home as best we could. We had taken icons from home and we prayed there. So again, she pays attention to material things that would help maintain the faiths. She says that those icons they used, they were taken from home. After that, I asked, how did locals know you were all believers, or did you conceal that? She first, it's interesting how she develops her thought on the subjects. So first, she answers, no, we didn't conceal that. They asked us, adherents of different faiths. They asked, but the law forbid. And she remembers how one Moldovan read the Bible, and they all sat together and listened. They took him and committed a trial. I don't know for how long. They forbade to read. And after that, she thought a little bit and said, we didn't hide among ourselves, but so we did hide from them a little. Apart from that, we prayed, we believed in God. Some of us even observed the fasts. What I see here, besides this narrative or this this thought on how she spoke about those practices that were concealed from others, the personal and family practices on maintaining faith. I see how they needed that religious experience, so they wanted to listen to the Bible read by an Orthodox but not an old believer. A little more from that interview, I asked, what icons did you take from home? I was interested in what was more important for them. And she answered, we took small icons. We took the Mother of God. And the man understood. He said, yes, mainly small ones, because these small icons could be easier concealed from others. She continued, we took a cross. After all, we were hiding, and we stood in the room and we prayed. I remember my mother taught. So she remembers prayers her mother was teaching her and her little brother. And it's interesting that the interview ended with her affirmation that ours stuck with it. They mostly stuck, didn't they? They mostly did. So she was sure that all believers, despite everything, they could preserve their faith. Usually, the researchers of old believer culture look at the old belief through the prism of normativity. They usually speak about following or violating religious rules. But the transfer of religion from the public to the private sphere, what is described and known to researchers as practices of the privatization of religion, was often accompanied by violations of a number of prohibitions and prescriptions. And it's interesting that mostly people were perfectly aware of those rules, but they violated them. It's not correct to look at the norms as at something absolutely stable, because there always takes place experimenting with norms, rule making, and variation for the sake of reproducing traditions. As people from Kunica told me, we violated rules in exile to remain Christians. So they did not go to church. They had no possibility to preserve ritual purity. They violated religious boundaries all the time. These facts, these memories from their lives, when spoken in dialogue with representatives of other generations, often puts the question, were they still all believers? And it's interesting that this interests not only researchers of all belief culture, but also representatives of all believer culture. They themselves often reflect on this topic when speaking about their past. What I think I have to add here is that preservation through adaptation and legitimate ways of violating rules was the only way to maintain their religiosity under those circumstances. And looking at normativity, we have to understand that experimentation with norm is normal. It's how this usually works. But besides looking at the old believer culture of the Soviet period as through the prism of normativity, we have to pay attention to their religious experience, to what they needed to feel when preserving their religion. So in this interview that I have shown you, you have seen that they were ready to listen to the Bible when the Moldovan was reading it. They concealed some family practices from others. But in the families of all believers, this knowledge was transmitted to younger generations. And also personal prayers were important for the religious experience when they could not go to church. So as in conclusion, I have to say that these memories of the exile, of their religious experience, of their lives in exile today, they play they play a kind of consolidating role. They are shared memories of strategies to overcome difficulties and maintain their faith. Thank you for your attention.